Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited for you all to be back because we are finally getting into the book of Revelation. Listen, we've covered the bulk of Daniel's prophecies, and so I think it's okay for us to turn to Revelation because the last chapters of Daniel focus on the final phases of prophecy, and those final phases are discussed extensively in Revelation. Now, throughout the next several sessions, I will attempt to paint a relevant and accurate picture of Revelation for those of you who are interacting with this book for the first time. And my hope is to also reintroduce this book to those of you who may have a bad taste from previous experiences. And I say this because I am not lost on how unpopular this book is amongst my generation and the generations that come after millennials. So, to begin our discussion, I think it will be beneficial to talk about the background of the book of Revelation. Like the book of Daniel, Revelation is an apocalyptic piece of literature. So, there will be parts that are literal, parts that are symbolic, and prophetic. There will even be parts that aren't necessarily chronological. And because this book has each of these more complex parts, we have to set a proper foundation so that we not only understand it for ourselves, but can also generally explain it to others as well. With that being said, it's first important to understand that while this book focuses on the revelation of Jesus Christ, it is also John's book, meaning that John is the author, the writer of the book of Revelation. And we're talking about John, the disciple, a man who walked and talked with the creator of the universe. John, a disciple who learned ministry and who learned theology directly under Jesus' feet. John, one of Jesus' inner circle. Yes, there were 12 disciples that traveled with Jesus in his 3 years of public ministry, but then there were just three disciples who went deeper with Jesus. There was Peter, James, and our man John. John, who would go on to become one of the leading apostles to guide the early Christian church after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's who the author of Revelation is. And John wrote Revelation towards the end of his life, somewhere towards the end of the first century, sometime between 81 to 96 AD. And at this point, the Christian church was still in its early phases. It wasn't even called the Christian church at this time. Yet, there was an understanding that this movement had Jesus at the center of its teachings. Jesus was the Messiah and focal point of this movement. And as Jesus' story was spreading amongst more Jews and Gentiles, many were accepting the gospel message of his self-sacrifice for humanity. Yet, the Roman Empire was still the leading power at the time. And the Roman Empire was pressing the Jews and Christians because of their faith in Jesus and obvious opposition to the Roman faith and Roman way of life. And Revelation immediately speaks to this reality for the early Christians. In Revelation 1, verse 9, John writes that he was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And just to make it even more clear, Patmos wasn't a vacation site. John was exiled to Patmos because he was so persistent in witnessing about Jesus. And so it was on Patmos, while forced to work in the quarries, that John received visions from God that he was to record and share with 7 early Christian churches that existed in a region of Asia that was dominated by Rome at the time. Now, unlike churches today, these 7 churches didn't have unique brand names like Pioneer Memorial Church, Loma Linda University Church, or Oakwood University Church. Rather, these churches' names were identified by the cities where they were located. So there was a church in Ephesus, in Smyrna, and Pergamum, and Thyatira, and Sardis, and Philadelphia, and in Laodicea. And similar to churches today, these seven churches had issues. In fact, like many churches today, each church had different issues because, like churches today, those churches were composed of unique people with their own cultures, preferences, and values. And because each church was located in different cities, they naturally had different motivations and inspirations. And I think that it is in this way that Adventist churches are directly similar to these seven churches in Revelation. Because this denomination is also filled with lots of churches that are scattered across numerous cities. And each of these churches across several cities are filled with families with goals, preferences, and cultures that inform how they do ministry. From the smallest of gatherings to the largest congregations, they each exist. And like the seven churches, something that we can all agree on is that each of our churches today have issues. There's nothing unnatural about that. It just affirms that, like these seven churches, our churches today need Christ. And so these churches had internal issues as well as external ones. And speaking to the external ones first, one of the major things they faced was pagan opposition. And here's what I mean when I say this. So today, there are numerous things that are normalized in secular culture that aren't acknowledged or practiced in most Christian spaces. For instance, Halloween is a very popular holiday that is celebrated on October 31st, but we as believers don't practice it. Friday and Saturdays are common bar and club hopping nights that several people go to drink and party at. But once again, these are not practices that are supported nor recommended by the church. And so I bring these examples up because as believers, we're sometimes looked at as we're out of place or like we're doing something wrong. And this is exactly what the seven churches dealt with. For instance, these seven churches, like many at the time, didn't participate in the typical Roman celebrations that at times honored the Roman pagan deities that the early Christians opposed. And because they went against the status quo, they were called atheists by the general public. But that's not all. The early Christians were scrutinized for practicing communion. In fact, they were called cannibals by the Romans because they referred to the bread and wine as Christ's body and blood. And so all of these things add up. And as a result, the early Christians had gradually lost their legal ground because of all the differences in their beliefs. Yet, this was not the only external issue that these churches faced. One of the less talked about issues that the early Christians faced was the hostility of the Jews. While these two religious groups believed in the same God, the shift in focus on the ministry and teachings of Jesus amongst Christians began to separate these groups. So these two groups began to separate naturally after the resurrection of Christ. Yet, what further drew these two religions apart were disagreements that took place during the war against Rome in 70 AD. When Rome led their attack on Jerusalem at this time, the early Christians apparently refused to join in the fight alongside the Jews. Due to this, the Jews appeared to have more issues with the early Christian church. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jews began to demonstrate a number of microaggressions against the Christian church. A prime example of this was the inclusion of an 18th benediction that was recited by the Jews at the end of their worship gatherings. The issue with this 18th benediction is that it was actually a curse against Christ and the Christians. So the Christians obviously never recited it. And because they never recited it, they were ultimately pushed out of the synagogues by the Jews and had no place to worship. And because the Jews had completely divided themselves from the Christians no longer had any legal protection because they were not a legally approved religion. And ultimately, without being a legal religion, this meant two important things for the early Christians. For one, this meant that the Christians could not worship freely on Saturdays, which was their primary day of worship. And two, this meant that the early Christians were expected to participate in the Roman worship gatherings. And so when you think about it, the early Christian churches were pressed from all sides and had a lot going against them from the general population. Yet, these churches didn't just have problems outside, but also in-house as well. And I have to say this again. Each church had its own unique set of problems. But if you've ever been a member of a church, you will see how relatable these issues are. So there were some churches that were great for the most part. These churches were the ones where most of the church was on the same page, with just a few members either not being committed or backsliding. Then you had the wishy-washy churches where you could draw a line right in the middle of the church. And for every serious believer, there was a believer who wasn't truly living a real Christian lifestyle. There were churches that had corrupt members and other churches that had corrupt leaders. Then there were churches where sin was just everywhere, where the church was just Christian in name only, but were the complete opposite in their actions. And there were churches that looked the part, especially from afar, churches that had a form of godliness, but when you got up close and could see beyond the facade, you could see just how destitute they are spiritually. And so I hope that you're beginning to see this important trend amongst these various churches, because the same issues that plagued these 7 churches in the first century are the same issues that plague many of our churches today. The only difference is that the specific issues that each congregation faces are dressed up differently. Yet the problems still exist. And so here's the reason why it's so important to comprehend the magnitude of the backdrop for the book of Revelation. This is so important for us modern believers to understand because the internal issues that these 7 churches faced were majorly impacted by the external problems that they faced. Let me say that again. The 7 churches' issues with remaining faithful to God were greatly impacted by the persecution they endured, impacted by their low socioeconomic status, and impacted by their overall social disconnection from the overarching Roman society. And so the major temptations that the early Christians were faced with was participating in some of the social and religious practices that were common in the day. 2 primary areas of tension were diet and sexuality. Diet was a point of tension because pagan festivals were common in this culture. And at these festivals, participants were expected to partake in the foods that were offered to the pagan idols. Now, by the end of these festivals, the participants were mostly drunk and participating in activities that were immoral. So this was a major problem for the Christian churches. But to add on to this, there were issues with sexual immorality. Once again, this topic is related to their religious culture. In Roman religious culture, there was a concept known as temple prostitution that was very popular. Citizens would engage in sexual acts with temple prostitutes because it was taught that doing so would bring fertility to the land and to the specific individuals engaged in the act. So this meant that anyone who wanted or needed economic gain, social gain, or even political gain were encouraged to participate in these immoral temple activities. And the tough realization is that the early Christians were in desperate need of economic gain, social gain, and political gain. So this too was a major point of tension for the early church, because no matter what hope you give people about the future, each individual still has to deal with the circumstances that are in front of them at the moment. And so I dive so deeply into this background of Revelation because these are the situations that John is speaking to in this book. He's aware of the issues that are hindering each of the seven churches. He's aware of the pressures that each individual Christian is faced with. He's aware of how much easier life would be if they chose to give in to the prevailing powers of the day. And because of this knowledge, he writes Revelation as a message of hope. He writes Revelation as a guidepost to these churches. He writes it to encourage the believers to hold on to what they know is true, even if it may be the hardest thing to do, because at the end of it, there is victory. And so this is important to us believers today and will be important to future believers because each of us is part of a church. We all belong to a body of believers that are looking for Christ's return. We also are believers who are faced with external pressures that at times cause internal friction within our church communities. And for many of us, the external pressures do at times seem insurmountable. Yet, we must remain strong because the prophecies in Revelation don't just provide hope to the first century believer, but these prophecies also provide hope to us today and those who will come after us tomorrow. So that's all I have for you all today. Be sure to come back next time as we continue our journey on Bible prophecy. See you soon.